Hello, all, and welcome to another episode of Market Pulse presented by Smart Touch. I'm your host, Aaron Fischera, and today we have a very special guest with us, Meeta Morrison, the architect and owner of MMD Architecture. Meeta, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. We got a really great conversation ahead of us today. We're going to be talking about sustainability practices in design. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. And I'm very excited to talk about topics that I love. So thank you.
Well, you've been at the forefront of the sustainability and the passive design process in architecture for a while now. For those that are listening, for over 15 years, Meeta has specialized in residential master plan and commercial architectural design. And well, Meeta, we'll start off with background. How'd you get involved in this field?
So in architecture or in sustainability. So
Let's
I think
let's
the
start let's
two.
start with architecture. Yeah, how do you mirror the two?
So I think I always wanted to be an architect, even before I knew what it was called. I started building things very early on. Making is what I like to call it. So I started making things. I remember as early as 3 or 4, making houses out of mud, sticks, whatever I could find, cardboard. And that actually is a part of the reason the sustainability is so important to me. I was using found materials, obviously, things that were left over. I was born in India in the early 60s, before the plastic revolution. So most of the materials I was using were things that were hard to come by, actually. It was very much of a reuse economy there. There was very little plastic. And so it wasn't until I came to the United States that I started seeing containers that were thrown away. And so that was like a big shock to me. I mean, just these very nice plastic things were being thrown away. Um, and over time, I would go back to India. And of course, plastic had arrived there by the mid 70s and by the early 80s in full force, and it was being used everywhere. And so it was going back and forth between the two countries. And here we have a very streamlined waste management system. In India, not so much. And so I would see plastic waste everywhere. And so early on, I started to recognize how humans were impacting the environment. So plastic bags were clogging sewers, and they were causing they looked terrible in the landscape. So
Yeah.
anyway, started to think about that very early on, and by the time that I got married and had my own home, in the 80s, I was taking string bags to the grocery store, and people would look at me like I was crazy, basically, because people were not doing that. So sustainability became something, as we address it now. Back then, it was more about like being eco-sensitive, and the terms were different. So I was, thinking about sustainability already when I started architecture school, which I didn't actually start until later in life after my kids were a little bit older. And then,
Really?
yeah, so my kids were already in school. And so I was looking at my children and thinking to myself, what is the world that we leave behind? Having traveled as much as we did, I got to see a lot of the things that in the United States we don't see. We don't see waste management specifically, and that is the end product of everything that we do. So sustainability was a key focus for me as soon as I started architecture school. My very first building that I designed for my first project at the end of the year was a building that was not air conditioned in Houston. And and
And you know
there
how
are
popular that's going to be, you know?
it was not it it was received very well, actually, because
Really?
people were shocked and surprised. So this was 2001. So that was a long, long time ago. But at the same time, I was also told that this was not doable. Um, I tended to disagree. Um, in 2003, I went to Australia and studied with an architect there, who is very well known for something called critical regionalism and passive design. And that was Glenn Murcutt. I met him in 2003 and saw his buildings, and he was building passive houses in the 80s, and doing it in Australia where the climate is extreme, you know. And so there was a concept of um, adjusting what our idea about comfort is. That's very difficult to convince people of here.
Yes.
And so, I came back really wanting to do nothing but passive buildings, and then quickly realized that that wasn't necessarily going to work. And so, what I like to think about is just the fact that green is really sort of gray. So, there are a lot of things that we can do for sustainability. Um, and sometimes even a passive house is not as sustainable as you might think, you know, depending on where it's built. It's like if you're building way out in the middle of nowhere, um, there is a certain cost that goes into doing that, like transporting the materials and
Yeah.
getting them out there. So I think that green is a little bit of a sliding scale. So um, I hope that answers that question.
So it sounds like we can never obtain 100% green or zero, but we should shoot for it at least, or try to minimize our carbon footprint as much as we can.
Absolutely. And I don't think that any building is, perfectly green. And there are so many ways, though, that we can make a building greener. We also have to think about comfort of the occupants. And sometimes the decisions that, as an architect, that I have to make have to do with the comfort of the occupant, not just their thermal comfort, how they feel inside the building, but also like how it makes them feel emotionally and financially, so all of those things come into play.
Well, how has that evolution changed when it comes to residential design, or at least the incorporation
Do you mean
from
for
from
myself?
yeah, from yourself and your experience with the clients? From the '80s, you're saying, everyone kind of had a raised eyebrow of, coming in with your own bags to the supermarket, to now it's almost expected to hear about energy efficient tools and savings within the home. So we're talking about 40 plus years of a gap here. What's been the evolution in your mind?
The reason for the evolution, I think, is just people's awareness of um, the fact that humans are having on our environment. And here's the thing: is that are we going to destroy the earth? Probably not. But if we continue to do the things that we do, the environment that humans can exist in is a very narrow environment. You
Yeah.
know, it
The
can't be too
the
hot,
Goldilocks.
right? Can't be too hot. It can't be too cold. We need oxygen. We need sunlight. We need clean water. And those are things that are beginning to uh, become a commodity. You know, Light, air, water, all of those things are becoming expensive to have. Housing is becoming expensive. And maybe we don't notice it as much in the US, but it's certainly noticeable across the globe. However, you know, I do think that here in the US, people are very open to listening to the ideas that would make for a better planet. And I know that's a very lofty goal, but I think that this is a country that really embraces, uh, lofty goals and ideals. That's what makes America what it is. So,
Well, and to that point, um, we could start with kind of a site planning, and let's just go with the dirt and taking these goals and actually putting it to practice. Where do you see we can begin the process for site planning with a focus on sustainability, but also remaining profitable? I mean, there is an end game here too.
there is an end game, and so there profitability is one of the things that drives. It's the thing that drives economies, right?
Mhm.
But it's also a short-term goal. Profitability is always a short-term goal, and that is where the responsibility of um, larger powers, government powers, can often help. But at the end of the day, the consumer is the one, because we are a consumer driven economy,
Mhm.
has to be educated and has to ask for those things. Like, they want a more sustainable home, they want a more energy efficient home. And I do think that there's a shift in that market. People do want that because they don't want to pay $800 in the summer for air conditioning, per month. And that's not that unusual anymore. People are paying that amount of money to
Oh
cool
yeah.
their home. And it's so in that sense, the market will be driven by the consumer at some point. They're going to say, no, I want a more energy efficient home. And the technologies to create those homes are becoming more affordable and more available. And so as that happens, people can see the benefit of the cost benefit of putting in an extra amount of money to insulate their home better or use more energy efficient windows, and then have that energy savings on their bills. But this is where the government has also been, or like governing authorities, so cities, states, and federal government. So federal government in the form of offering subsidies
Mhm.
to people for everything from better insulation, better windows, to um, solar panels.
Yeah, tax rebates on solar panels.
Exactly. So those are things that people are interested in. So, are you going to put in a heat exchange, geothermal system? Are you going to put in a heat pump, water heater? You can get a significant rebate on some of those things. And so I think the consumer is very interested in that. And also energy codes. And so that is another way that governing authorities are helping. So if you look at the example of, say, Austin,
Mhm.
um, Austin is a fairly unique city, in that it owns the public owns the utility company. So Austin Energy is owned by the public.
Yeah.
And the money that Austin Energy makes goes into public funds, which is great. But if they have to continue to build more and more electric plants, power plants, that increases the amount of money that they have to spend doing that. So it's in the interest of the public to reduce the demand. And so Austin actually started a program back in the early 90s that's called the Austin Energy Green Building Program. And it was to encourage people to do things to reduce their energy consumption. So that's one way. And then the other way is by adopting codes that are calling builders to make more energy efficient buildings. But I think that the heart of the point that you're talking about is what interests me,
Mhm.
which is the way that we treat the site, and how our buildings relate to the sites that they sit on. There's certain things that are a given. We know where the sun rises and the sun sets. We know where winds come from in general, and we know the general climate of a given area. You know, is it moderate? Is it temperate? Is it very frigid? You know, all of those things. Is it hot and dry?
Mhm.
So designing buildings that address all of those climatic factors, excuse me, I was having a little bit of a tongue twister there, uh, is really important. So when a developer is putting in 500 homes, maybe so, you know, nowadays there are so many homeowners associations and there's deed restrictions on most of these developments. Um, a developer could actually make it so that their deed restrictions address the siting of the building on a lot. And even before that, a developer could plan in such a way that the buildings can be oriented on the lots so that let's say the house, the major axis of the house is going east to west, so that it's the bigger sides of the house are facing north and south. And I think that that's entirely doable and possible, but it has to start at the planning stage, not after the lots have already been subdivided at that point.
What does that look like? Let's, you know, and I know we've looked at parcels of land. You kind of talked about passive design and how it could be incorporated. But for our listeners, let's say I'm a developer in Texas. I see a nice piece of property outside of Austin. Where do I go from there? How do I work with Meeta and incorporate passive design?
Well, so one of the things that we would do is we would do what I call a pre-design study, and we would look at the property. And actually, what I would say to any developer, any person who's getting, whether it's, you know, someone getting ready to buy a lot
Hmm.
or someone who's getting ready to buy, you know, 500 acres to put in multiple housing units, I would say is come talk to me or to another architect who believes in sort of passive design principles for the siting of buildings, and to have us look at it and tell you before you even purchase the site whether or not it's a great site. So here's some things that I would say. So in Austin, for example, we have a lot of southerly breezes. So the winds in the summertime come from the south. And if you notice, when the sun goes down, typically if you're sitting at the bottom of a hill, it
Hmm.
doesn't matter what direction, but the wind is going to come down that hill. So maybe finding, since we're in Austin, if it's a hilly site, looking at it and seeing how that hill is oriented, um, is it going to help with night flushing, which is basically the concept of wind flowing downhill at night because the earth cools a little bit slower than the air does. Um, so those are some of the things that we would look at even before you purchase the lot. And then there's other things to look at the site. You know, is there a significant amount of trees that maybe protect the site from the western sun? Is the site going to be able to support, say, streets that the majority of the streets running east to west? So perhaps the lots could be oriented north and south. And so, you know, looking at the site selection at the very beginning is super important. Once we have the site selected, then we start looking into how to actually subdivide the lot so that it will give you the most number of units with good light, good solar exposure, good protection from northern winds, all of those things that can affect the energy consumption of a building.
Makes
So
sense.
I hope that it's not it. You know, it's interesting. Site selection and what I'm talking about, the passive principles, are not that complicated, but um, sites are complicated. You know.
It,
And
it
so
it sounds like it can't be an afterthought. It has to be at the inception.
it has to be right at the beginning because I can't tell you how many houses as an architect I go into where people want to remodel their home because they don't get enough light
Hmm.
or because they have a room that is too hot all the time or it's too cold all the time. And, let's say you're in Texas and you have your living room is facing west, which, it's a nice thing. You want to see the sunset. Maybe your windows are facing that way. But it also makes it so that room can be exceedingly hot at that time. And so now we have to think about more of a solution to a problem rather than maybe orienting the building in such a way that your major windows don't face west. Maybe they face north, so you get more light. And the windows that face west, maybe we put exterior shutters on it.
That
Because,
makes sense. Yeah.
so yeah, because that's the other thing that a lot of people believe that if they put shades on a window on the inside, that is going to keep their house cooler. Well, the heat is already in the house at that point. So ambiently, you're going to feel a little bit cooler in that room because it's not direct hitting, the sun isn't directly hitting you, but the heat is already there. Your air conditioning system is already working to remove that heat. So really thinking about how your windows are oriented. And it may be that we put them to the west, but if we do that, then we have to think about the solutions and whether or not there are solutions. So at least you have a choice.
Well, and kind of going off of choices, when it comes, as we go from the land to the buildings or even the material and infrastructure into residential or master plan communities, what do you see as the go-to sustainable building materials or technologies to incorporate?
So again, I think this is a little bit of a gray area, right? So although I do think that there are sustainable technologies that are being developed every day, and it's an exciting time to be an architect. I mean, there are so many things from everything from, prefabricated parts to prefabricated buildings to printed houses. So far, unfortunately, the cost is not really any lower than the cost to build stick built buildings. And so, what we were talking about earlier about economy. So, until we hit some sort of economy of scale or, a revolution in the way that some of these technologies are produced, people are going to continue to do stick built buildings because they are still cheaper. They're a cheaper method. And it isn't just about the cost of the building materials themselves, it's also the training of the people, the economy that is driving that building. It's not that easy to find people who can, do a, what is it called? There are different types of panelized constructions that require training, and it's not out there yet. And that's not to say, so the product I was thinking of is Hebel, which is an autoclave concrete product.
Okay.
There are other, it's a lightweight concrete panel. It's used all over Europe, for example. It's highly insulative. It's supposed to be a fairly green technology. But the cost to build it is still higher than stick built construction. And there still aren't people out there who can do it, and the workers in the industry are not out there. So as far as technology, um, in actual building materials, I'm still, it's not that I'm a skeptic because I do think that these things are coming. These are coming and it's just going to be a matter of time. It's in the same way that solar panels, 20 or 30 years ago, it was really one, not very cost effective.
And they're
Um,
bulky and just
and I mean, they're still bulky, but I think designers are putting them in at the beginning. And so if you are designing a building with it, there are much better ways to incorporate that into a design than to come back later and put them in on top.
Hmm.
But even with solars, there are different types of solar panels that are being, or PV products that are being developed that um, are more integrative into the building envelope, right? So in the same way that those solar panels were not affordable, not very efficient, et cetera, et cetera. But today they're more affordable and they're more energy efficient. And, you're collecting more energy with solar panels today than you were 20 years ago. So I think that the technologies in the construction industry that are coming to light right now, 20 years from now, I think they're going to be in a different place. So it is a very exciting time to be in this space. I'm very hopeful. Everything from concrete and other materials that are using recycled building materials to building materials that are going together faster. There was a building material that 20 years ago that people were using to make oil rigs, for example, which is called a pull-treated fiberglass, and it's a very strong, very lightweight material. And now people are making panels out of it. So using it for panelized construction. So that's another material that's out there that could have some potential for faster construction that is more energy efficient. Now, other than that, because I deal so much with retrofitting,
Hmm.
which is something that you and I talked about a little bit earlier. So retrofit housing, what is that? Like basically, if you think about where we are in the United States right now in terms of building, 40%, I'm sorry, the majority of the housing stock in America is 40 years or older.
Hmm.
So Um, and so these are houses that were built in the 80s. They don't have the same sort of regulations for energy efficiency that a new built house does. But I don't think knocking down houses and building new ones is a particularly green solution because a house that's existing is typically going to be a greener solution than one that's not. And because, and we could go into a lot of reasons why. Sometimes there may be a reason to truly knock something down, um, you know, but a lot of times that embodied energy that exists in that building is worth saving. And
Okay.
so retrofitting the house or other commercial building to be more energy efficient is something that's really important. And so some of my go-to products I do use foam insulation. I also like blown-in bibs are a great solution for insulation. So adding insulation or redoing insulation altogether, replacing windows with more energy efficient windows, and using materials that are recyclable. So maybe not doing vinyl windows, although even vinyl windows are suggesting that they are a green technology. I haven't delved into that enough to be able to give a definitive answer, but aluminum windows and steel windows, which are quite expensive, but they are also making them to be more energy efficient than they were, say, 40 years ago. So those things are really important as far as technologies are concerned.
Rather than, I know there seems to be that kind of still a period of economy of scale and education and retooling the current workforce to enact it. Um, but based on your expertise and insights, let's just look out the next few years with the current market. What are your predictions or trends you're seeing when it comes to the residential architecture and as well as sustainability?
I do think that given the trends that we're seeing in the housing market, as in we have higher interest rates than we've had for quite a while, and people are hesitant to buy, or to sell the home that they're in, because the typical time that someone stays in a house is 5 years. That's like a average, and they sell and they buy up. But I think more and more people are thinking about staying put and remodeling their home. And so that is where the retrofit economy is an important one. And so thinking about how to retrofit housing, we call it renovation, remodel, retrofit. So there's a bunch of different terms, but like going back and assessing a home for a homeowner and helping them figure out how to get the most out of the house that they are in. And sometimes that is, affecting the inside, the house plan, because we don't live the same way we did 40 years ago either, and so uh, making the house more livable for today. Does that answer your question, Aaron?
Yeah, no, it does.
Okay.
No, it absolutely does. I see it as well. I think there's still going to be, with supply, definitely a need for new home builds, but there's also a hesitation of leaving your current home just based on interest rates. So it, typically, people tend to go and renovate. That's,
That's
if
right.
you, so that's I can kind of agree with that assessment as well. Um,
But I do think that there's something to be said for the new construction, because there is a shortage of housing, right? And how do we address that? And how do we talk to the builders out there, developers? So one of the things that I hear a lot of people say, and because of my experience with retrofit, which is kind of so I do new builds as well. But for me, it's very important to have an efficiency of space. And so a house that is 2,000 square feet and well planned is not the same as a house that's 2,000 square feet and not well planned. So getting the most out of your space is very important. So that can save the builder money if it's built well with a well laid out plan. How many times have you been in a house and you go, wow, this feels a lot bigger than 2,000 square
oh,
feet?
oh yeah.
Right? And then sometimes you go into a house that's much bigger and you're surprised at how big it is. It's because of the way that space is planned. And and although, because I do so much custom housing, it may seem like, well, but that's a very custom solution, and it only applies to um, you know Mr. and Mrs. Smith or whatever, who came to me to do their very special home. But the truth is, there are some things that are fairly universal in how we perceive space. And at the end of the day, space can really affect your health, your well-being, your mental state, how you work, how you play, how you live. And we're human. And I don't think that it's that different, from person A to person B. And so there is a way to design housing at a larger scale, so multiple housing units, that we start at the very beginning where we think about the site selection. A house that it's full of light and gets good breezes and has good relationship to the outdoor, which is another factor that I think is extremely important, is that our building's relationship to the landscape and how we perceive it
There should be
as we,
a connectivity between the two.
yes, I think that buildings that connect the landscape to the inside are much more successful for the occupants. They feel better in them, they like it. People like it. So thinking about that with the developer right from the very beginning, and even if it involves an HOA sort of situation where we're sitting down and writing rules about how buildings will be built. If it's a development that has, multiple different builders who are coming in and buying separate lots and building on there, those HOA rules might be really helpful in making sure that the community has this aspect where people want to live there, you know. And so that's the other part of sustainability that is really important is community, you know. So building developments that embrace community, that embrace diversity, and embrace accessibility to all different types of users is important, and it's something to consider both in site selection and also in the way that the development is planned from the very beginning.
Excellent. Well, Mita, I know we're kind of coming towards our closing thoughts, and for our listeners, as we look towards a more sustainable future, what are some key principles or message you would want to leave with our audience, especially when it comes to um, planning, site selection, building, or even renovating their existing homes?
So I think early on, I had talked about something, you know, in my own education. And there was a term that was coined back in the 80s, and it was called critical regionalism. And it was this idea that the style of architecture should reflect the region that it is in. And it was a sort of a reaction to the modern movement. So the modern building, as it was conceived, you know, back in the 40s and 50s, was this building that could be anywhere, like this
Very
that you could.
utilitarian.
Well, it was this building that was designed, and it didn't matter where it was put because air conditioning was a thing. And so humans had learned how to control their environment, so they could just take that building and they could put it anywhere.
Mhm.
So the term critical regionalism was a reaction, and it basically said that you can't do that. You can't ignore the environment that you're in. I am beginning to think that there should be a new term, and it should be called climate regionalism. And essentially, it's the idea that yes, you do need to think about, you know, and that critical regionalism also contained an element of the culture, like what is your culture? So like there are architects in Texas who build buildings that reflect the culture of Texas. So big metal roofs, you know, uh, different like large porches, and those things are great because they're actually addressing the climate, because those are things that have been around for a long time and they are addressing our climate. But I do think that there should be something where you're really looking at your local conditions. So climate regionalism would be something where you're just not just looking at the weather, your site, but also the availability of things, you know, the availability of materials. The way that we build here in Texas should not be the way that we build in Boston. And people who live in Boston and people who live in Texas know that, but a lot of times the education of, you know, the way that we build and the information that we find is more generalized in, you know, how things are built. But like, for example, here, humidity is a huge concern. And so, you know, it's like we build these buildings that are super sealed, but we're not really accounting for the amount of moisture that gets trapped. And so that's something that we have to think about in our local climate that we have. I hope that, you know, so that just like thinking about that. The other thing that I think that um, that the general public, the consumer, needs to think about is waste management in your project,
Mhm.
um, and that starts at the very beginning. So there are states, California, for example, is moving towards. I think that you're required to recycle 90% of the waste in a remodel at this point. Now, I may not be exactly right on that rule, but I do think that's where we're headed. So that's in a remodel. So new construction, what is that going to be? 100%? I don't know. Like, we're getting to a point where we can't afford to just throw things away. So designing buildings that are using our resources more efficiently, recycling things that we can't use, maybe whatever products are being thrown away are used either at the site, at the next building, or having materials that can be reused, you know. So that also using materials that are locally sourced. So, for example, in Austin, we have several companies that make finishes, tile products, for example, locally. Within 600 miles of Austin, Texas, there are multiple places that produce windows, very good energy efficient windows. And so thinking about where and I think this has to begin with the consumer again. And architects play a role. We have to inform our consumer that this is what you need to do.
Hmm.
But using materials and methods and labor and all of these things that are closer in is going to be super important. I do also think that for new construction, thinking about, and even retrofit, thinking about how we're using water. So energy is important. So is water. How are we using, conserving, and collecting water? So those are, I believe that is the wave of the future. And to that, I think what we're getting to is the net zero building. Essentially, and I think that's the point that I've been trying to get to with all of this. So what is net zero? So I think that more and more consumers know that terminology now. So a net zero building is a building that produces as much energy or more energy than it uses. And the way that you achieve that is by making super insulated buildings and buildings that use less energy to begin with, and also generate their own energy by using, solar panels, wind power, geothermal sources, those type of things that would give you a more energy efficient and the building of the future, basically.
Excellent. I mean, we still, it sounds like we still have a long ways to go, but Mita, there was something you said earlier that really stuck, that summed it up perfectly. Going green is sort of gray.
It
Very.
really is. Yes. And I think that a lot of times, and I'm finding this less and less. So whenever I have a new client, I give them a survey to fill out for me. And one of the questions is, are you interested in green technologies? And I'll tell you, there isn't a single person who says no. you know Everyone says yes, or I'd like to know more. And so everyone wants to know more. The other thing that I can tell you that is super important is what are called green building. So I wrote it down because I'm terrible with acronyms. So it's the green building rating systems. Okay.
Oh, and I
So
can tell you too, you architects, every acronym under the sun with you guys. So
we're terrible. Terrible.
yeah.
And so the green building rating systems idea. Um, so again, in Austin, we have Austin Energy Green Building, which is a green building rating system. And it is actually one of the first in the country. And everyone has heard of LEED.
Hmm.
Now LEED actually is not as old as Austin Energy Green Building, which is a local system. So there are more and more green building rating systems out there. So find one. LEED doesn't really, or ask your architect or your designer or your builder if they're using a green building rating system. Why? Because this is a third-party system. It's not me rating your building. It's not the builder rating your building. It's a system that's designed to help you get the most energy efficient building. But it isn't just about thermal comfort. So it's not just about air conditioning and heating, which is a big factor. But we're also looking at other things, and those are things that I brought up in our conversation. It's like, what are the materials that are being used? Are you recycling everything? How is water being used on the site? You know, is there off-gassing in your building? So all of those things are factors that come into play in most green building rating systems. There are some that are out there that are great. The LEED system is great. Unfortunately, for single family housing, it's not always a good option because it's not really made for the one-off house. If you're a developer, great, you can use it because you're building a lot of the same buildings and that system can apply to all of those buildings. But if you're doing one house, more than likely finding a local green building rating system is going to be the way to go, or finding someone who is maybe a FIAS consultant, which is, or FIAS as it's pronounced, Passive House Institute United States. It's another green building rating system, and that one is very focused on a highly efficient exterior thermal envelope. So super insulated walls, triple pane windows, and alternative energy sources. And its goal is the net zero house or the net zero building. So I do think that all of this is becoming more and more mainstream. It's no longer something people don't know about. The informed homeowner, the informed developer, the informed building owner, commercial building owner is going to know about all of these things. And then waste management is something that's important also, not just the waste stream from your construction, but also waste management. So the waste, as in the sewage coming out of your building. So that's also an industry that's growing in research. Like that's a big problem. It's like, how do we manage the waste coming out of buildings? To put it into perspective, Erin, I believe that 15% of the world's economy is focused on construction, building construction. That is huge. And by 2030, I read somewhere, and I tend to remember statistics really well, but often don't remember where I read it. So I
That's
read
dangerous.
somewhere, what?
I said that's dangerous. Be
It
careful.
is dangerous. I read somewhere, but that one I've read multiple times. So that one I don't think
Yeah, no, no,
is,
that, and I can confirm that same stance. I'm
yeah.
familiar with that.
But I read somewhere, and maybe you know this, that by 2030, so in 2020, it was significantly less. So it was like 10% of the world's economy. And so today in 2023, it's grown that much. It's like 14.6% of the world's economy is construction. And so they're estimating by 2030, it's going to be like 20% of the world's economy. So construction is a contributor to greenhouse gases in massive ways. And that's just construction. That does not take into account the life of the building and the effect that the building has on the environment after that. And at some point, both as design professionals, as someone who's in the construction industry, and as consumers, we can't afford to ignore this anymore. So
No, it definitely sounds like we have to put in perspective the short-term gain against the long-term costs.
exactly. And so the gray area is where I'm what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So the gray area is that as a consumer, we always have to make choices. People can't always afford everything. As a designer, as an architect, I try to help them make good choices. So, like windows and insulation are really important. That's probably going to be your first line of defense, you know. And so, helping the client make good choices in their budget to get a more energy efficient home is our responsibility as architects and as builders and in the construction industry.
Oh, me, I thoroughly appreciate this crash course, and hopefully our listeners. And for those that are for those that are listening, Mita, if any of our listeners want to again talk contact with you or just pick your brain about some of the things that we talked about here today, what would be the best way?
The best way is to go to my website and you can just fill out the contact form. My website is mmdarchitecture.com, so it's fairly easy to remember. And then also I'm on the social media channels, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. You can definitely reach me through there. All three of those have a professional page as well as my personal. So if you want to reach me on my professional page, please. And yeah, I'm pretty good about answering emails and communications. And then typically I will, like, if someone is really interested in our services, I will sit down with you for, and a 30-minute session to get an idea of what you want. And then also, even if you decide not to work with me, I will be sending you the survey that I talked about. And what I have found from talking to my clients is that survey is often very helpful to them in figuring out what they want. And so it's not just about me figuring out what I want, but usually clients are also trying to figure out what they want and need. So yeah,
It definitely helps to have a guide like yourself. Um,
thank you.
so, Mita, I appreciate your time, and for those that are listening, thank you again for spending time on the Market Pulse presented by Smart Touch, and we look forward to seeing you again on our next episode.
Erin, thank you so much for having me on. And you asked wonderful questions and made it very easy for me to communicate how I feel about this industry. I love being an architect and I love doing what I do. So thank you.
Awesome. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Bye.